This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Tyrants and Teakettles by Lesley Herron. Chapter 13, Quirkus. Piper waded through the various piles of abandoned treasures and forgotten inventions, practicing her grace as she navigated her way barefoot toward her brother. She stepped over the sleeping cyborg and leaned against the table. "How's it going over here?" Atticus chewed on his tongue, his hands shaking as he plucked up a small tube with a pair of tweezers. A faint shushing sound escaped his lips as he examined the tube and moved it to place it back into the arm. "This is very delicate work." His voice was almost distant, as if he wasn't replying to her question, but speaking aloud to himself. He did this with almost every piece that was removed from and replaced back within, bolts and wires alike. Berg whirled around, shining a bright electric light directly into Piper's face. "It's very delicate work, Mom." Piper clicked her tongue against her cheek and put a hand up to shield her eyes from the burning light. "Okay, I'll get it. Stop blinding me, you rusted idiot." The robot quickly returned to his lamp-holding duties, and she watched her brother insert another wire. "You've been saying that for the last couple of hours. Are you gonna be able to get this put back together? I really don't want to have to tell Gramps here you busted his arm." She stuck a finger against one of the forgotten sheets of paper that littered the desk, pulling it closer to her. It was written in Vel's handwriting, which was almost illegible in its tiny script, and was explaining something in an overly complex manner, using phrases like top anti-top quark pair events and bounded error quantum polynomial time. Even with the arrows and bolded or underlined text, she was fairly certain he had just been making the words up. Robot nonsense, she concluded as she shrugged while pushing it back where she had found it. Atticus looked up, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. He was wearing a satisfied smile as he turned to face his sister. "Did you say something?" He set down his tweezers and began double-checking his work with Berg, comparing it against a few hastily drawn diagrams he had made when tearing the thing apart. Piper began fiddling with a contraption at the end of the table that was covered in springs. She put on a flat smile and turned back to study her brother. "What do you do for the college?" "What do you mean?" Atticus barely looked up from his work as he leaned over to make sure the wires were connected in the right configuration. Piper really wanted to ask how he could work for an institute so bent on progress that everything else be damned, or how he could help supply that process. Had he created any of those death machines she had seen with her own eyes? Was this college grooming him to be an artificer of war? But she knew that her brother wouldn't understand her questions, regardless of how she delivered them. The stress of cobbling together a question correctly caused the device to collapse beneath her fingernail, and a spring shot off into the shop. She followed it with her eyes for a moment, before settling on, "I guess, well, what is it that you contribute to the college?" Atticus chuckled to himself. "I just build them stuff." He glanced over at his sister as he picked up another tool. The look on her face told him that was not an acceptable answer. "Well, I've made a lot of ease-of-life projects for them. Things like earless glasses and hands-free teacups and self-measuring teaspoons. I even brought them an auto-cleaning chamber pot." He frowned a little, flipping down another magnifying glass to bring his work into larger detail. "Well, they didn't really want any of that. But they did like my giant robotic hamster that belched out fire." Atticus continued pulling down magnifiers on the large monocle over his left eye, until almost 10 of them had been arranged in his line of sight. "It wasn't until I made Berg here," he motioned to his shoulder with the end of a fine-tipped screwdriver, "that I think they changed their minds. My teacher at the college said that they loved him, and wanting to know how I did it." His voice trailed away as he resumed the delicate task of readjusting the output cables. Sadness began to tug at Piper's face. "You don't think they want to use your inventions for anything bad, do you?" Atticus glanced up long enough to give her an incredulous look. "Of course not. I mean, how could a giant fire-breathing hamster be evil? It's just a machine, and machines aren't good or bad." Piper sighed and leaned farther over the table to place her head on her arms. That was the end of that conversation. "When I disappeared, did you think about looking for me?" Atticus blinked a few times and shook his head slowly. "I was going to, but Chester said he was going to find you." A wide grin broke away the sad, solemn look on his face. "And he did! And now I'll get to show you all me other inventions." "Yeah, he did." Piper choked down her rage and hid it beneath a soft smile. It wasn't her brother's fault that he was so easily manipulated. "The thing is, the people who took me away, well, they work for the college. So maybe you working for them isn't the best—" A loud snort cut her off, followed by an angry grunt. She looked over to see the cyborg stirring. This chat would have to wait till later. "Oi, Granddad's awake. Are you finished with that thing yet?" Warning. Increased episodes of unconsciousness may lead to brain damage.
"Give it a rest,"
Vel grumbled. He slowly cracked open an eye to find himself laying face down on a filthy concrete floor. His skull was thrumming, almost vibrating with pain. He felt as though it might explode at the slightest jostle. Shimmying his knees beneath himself, he forced his lead body into a crawling position. Everything about him seemed to weigh a ton, and the process of moving made his muscles cry out. He blinked a few times, forcing the fog from his mind and bringing the room into focus. He reached out for the bars on the nearest chair to help him to his feet, but nothing happened. What was going on, he thought, as he continued to try and reach out for the chair to no avail.
"Computer?"
Running diagnostics.
Whatever was in that tea had been ridiculously potent. The floor continued to pitch sideways, threatening to haul him back to his stomach. Vel felt like he could slump back down on the concrete floor and take another 12-hour nap, but inability to move his joints was alarming, helping bring his head back into clarity. He managed to get his feet fully under himself, and he fell back into a sitting position. Vel blinked a few times as he wiped away the damp drool from his cheek. The room stopped spinning and piles of junk around him became more clear. Piper's innocent face came into sharp focus.
"You,"
he grumbled, lifting a hand to level a threatening finger at her. Or, at least, that was what he had intended to do. But once again, his arm refused to cooperate.
Diagnostic complete. Error found. Location, right elbow joint.
Vel closed his eyes, ignoring the pounding in his head.
"What kind of error?"
Error code 65941. Component not found.
"Not found? What?"
It was that moment that he looked down and realized his arm, his beautifully crafted mechanical prosthetic, was no longer attached to his body. He spun around to see Atticus leaning over the table to look down at him, goggles comically magnifying one of his eyes.
"Tell me you didn't,"
Vel began, slowly pushing himself into a standing position. When he saw what was sitting on the workbench, it made him want to sink back into unconsciousness. His arm was laid out, metal plates pulled away to expose the innards, like a fish in the process of being filleted. He just managed to cover his mouth with his remaining hand to keep the noise of terror from escaping. Atticus was wearing a bright, genuine smile that stretched from ear to ear. "It's okay.
I'm just putting the final touches on these dial-looking things here. Then soldered a funny-looking coil to the brackets with all the bumps, and it should be ready for reattachment."
Vel paled, but his head hurt too bad to shout. Instead, he gently lowered himself into a familiar armchair.
"I never should have left home."
A painful, strident tone rang throughout Vel's body as his cybernetic arm snapped back into place. The reconnection of the wires to his nerves had always been agonizing and possibly the worst thing about having a mechanical limb. He hissed in a deep breath through his nose, calming the flame that was shooting throughout his nervous system. He whispered a silent prayer and attempted to flex his fingers. They moved at the whim of his slightest thought, and he watched the joints when he clenched his hand into a fist. There was a power resonating there that he hadn't felt before. It was rippling through his arm, and he could feel the plates shifting to allow more flexibility in the synthetic muscle.
"Whoa! What did you do?"
Vel looked up at Atticus, who was still wearing that silly grin.
"I managed to increase the kinetic output by 42%. By running the main systems in parallel rather than in series, I increased the amperage. I also got rid of a bunch of unnecessary junk that was in there."
Atticus gestured to a jumble of wires, circuitry, and metal rods sitting on the desk.
"Now your arm should feel lighter and do more for you with less effort."
Vel's eyebrows shot up in disbelief.
"Color me impressed. As long as it doesn't blow up in my face, that is. Good job, kid."
He clapped his left hand on Atticus's shoulder and offered him a rare smile.
"Now, let's get to work on that device."
He nodded down to the remnants of the portal locker that sat forgotten on a separate table. Atticus beamed up at the cyborg.
"That's already done."
He gestured to a large tarp draped over something massive.
"After I took apart your arm, I was able to finally make sense of all the little gizmos in that thing of yours. Wasn't too hard to assemble a similar device after that."
Vel walked over to what he had assumed was a covered carriage hidden away. He pulled against the tarp and it fluttered to the ground, revealing a massive amalgamation of twisted wires and hammered copper. There were conduit poles, tiny Tesla coils, and a gilded platform with a series of levers and hand cranks. How could something like the portal locker, a handheld device, be recreated as this monstrosity of engineering? It looked like something that had fallen out of the pages of an H.G. Wells novel. It was the size of an SUV and looked as if it weighed roughly the same as an elephant. There was a spot in the middle of the contraption where a large metal arch created something of a path. This was, presumably, where the portal was meant to appear. Vel brought a hand up to rub the back of his neck. The construction seemed completely nonsensical. Even his computer couldn't make heads or tails of it. He turned to Atticus, his brows knitted in confusion.
"How does this work?"
"Well, it's quite simple." Atticus rolled his sleeves up, a classic indication that his explanation would be anything but simple.
"The power cables connect to the throw switch over there, and that will send the electricity down into the machine, just like your arm. Then that power surges through the coils and into the poles, where they will begin working their way through the circuitry." "I know how electricity works. I meant, how does it make a portal?" "Oh, right. Well, I don't have any of the bits and pieces the original had, so I had to make do with some of my own design."
Atticus lifted a wooden panel, indicating a rat's nest of wires, tubes, and coils.
"That was the easy part, but I didn't have one of them computer biscuits, or whatever you called them, so that's where my friend here—"
He paused to wave over Berg, who rolled up to greet him happily.
"We'll be using his superior math skills to run the numbers and make sure we get the proper gateway destination."
That giant smile returned to his face as he glanced back over his shoulder, eager for a response. Vel's eyebrows came down into a frown. He wasn't an engineer. That had been his brother. Sure, he could repurpose and build machinery, but anything more complex than an engine or a simple circuit board, and he was lost. And at this moment, things weren't adding up right. He had so many questions, but one stood out.
How does Berg know the right destination? Did you figure out a way to track the other half?
Not exactly. After reading your notes on quantum computing, I realized that Berg here runs on a similar principle. What we realized is that we want the failure rate of any quantum algorithm equal or less than 1/3, and a non-probabilistic algorithm that can run in polynomial time would be in this complexity class. Additionally, you can run an algorithm an arbitrary number of times, making the success equivalent to probability of at least 1/2 plus n to the power of -c for an input length of n and any positive...
Vel simply blinked as he watched the young man continue to rattle off quantum theory like it was basic addition.
And therefore we will virtually always arrive at the correct answer, regardless of the question. Meaning, we aren't tracking the location, we are just guessing where it is and getting it correct every time. Simple, right?
Vel nodded slowly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm glad you understood my notes.
In truth, he had no idea what the boy had just said. All the quantum theory he had written down on the schematics was contributed by his AI, which had been so kind as to provide the archived images of Eric's original designs, which he then copied onto paper.
Did you really understand any of that?
Piper asked, shooting the cyborg a suspicious look. Vel pulled a face as he looked down at her.
I'm still mad at you for drugging me.
Piper scoffed and folded her arms in front of her.
I'm sorry, but look, I did that for your sake. For some reason, you don't trust me brother to know what he's doing, but he does. So if drugging you was the only way to get you to relinquish your arm, then that's what I was going to do. Now you have your way home, and no harm done.
Vel rolled his eyes and let out a sigh.
All right, fine. You're right. I shouldn't have been so quick to doubt him. Thank you for drugging me.
Atticus pulled off his magnifiers and wiped away the sweat that had built up beneath the eyepiece.
Let's try this baby out. Berg, you got those numbers ready?
The robot had just finished hooking himself into a series of nodes and swiveled around.
Oh, yes, sir. Running probability statistics now.
The mechanical man wrapped his thick fingers around two of the levers and began adjusting them to precise positions. A mad gleam shone in Atticus's smile, and for the first time, Vel wondered if the pint-sized tinker was a well-disguised mad scientist. He was just about to suggest that perhaps they do some lighter testing when the boy leapt onto the gilded platform.
Pull the lever!
Atticus indicated to a large golden pull bar with a flourish of his hand. Vel complied against his better judgment and forced the heavy switch into the on position. There was a hum, and the machine clanged and clunked as its internal organs trundled to life. Jolts of blue electricity began to arc upwards towards the two large spheres near the top of the machine. The smell of ozone overtook the room as the air virtually crackled with power.
Stage 1 complete! Redirecting current to trans-dimensional stabilizers!
Atticus hauled back on one of the many levers in front of him. Light erupted from the archway, and jagged bolts of lightning shot outward. They slammed into the roof of the facility and exploded one of the inhabiting creatures into a smoldering cascade of ash. Berg began to move at a phenomenal rate, adjusting the many levers before him to precise angles. More arcs of electricity shot forth, impacting piles of half-finished inventions, blowing out windows, and lighting a desk on fire. Atticus let forth a mad laugh.
It's working!
Papers rained down as the bird creatures swooped from their perches in a frantic attempt to flee the electricity. Vel managed to grab a hold of Piper and hauled her behind one of the remaining tables, flipping it on its side to barricade them from the danger. Atticus spun a dial all the way to the left, then reached up and grabbed the handle of a massive switch in both hands.
Collapsing the field in 3, 2, 1...
As the switch fell into place, a shockwave blew outward, tossing Atticus and Berg to the floor. It forced the desk into Vel and Piper and blew the large hangar door off its hinges. Vel pushed the table away and looked in the direction of the machine. The room was calm, all chaos abated, and a beautiful circle hung in midair, a swirling pool of deep greens and golds. His ticket home. Atticus leapt to his feet and pumped both fists in the air. "It's stabilized!" Piper brushed herself off and got up, giving Vel a smug grin. She jabbed him in the arm with a playful punch. "Told ya he was special." Vel grinned from ear to ear and rushed the boy, hauling him up into the air.
Ha! You did it! I take back everything I said about you.
Atticus squirmed in the grip. "Ow! Ow! 42% stronger, remember?" Vel dropped him.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Atticus righted himself and then looked up at the cyborg. "Wait, what was it you said about me?" Vel clapped him on the shoulder again and shook his head.
Don't worry about it.
He moved around the kid and stepped in front of the portal. Atticus had proved himself up to this point. He may have been a little odd, but he had yet to display any of the questionable engineering outcomes his otherworldly counterpart had been famous for. This meant that Vel was probably only a few steps away from seeing his brother again. Vel looked back over his shoulder at the siblings and the metal man.
Thanks for this. You know, I think I might actually miss you guys.
Piper reached out. "Wait, you're leaving now?" Vel had a speech prepared for this moment. No, don't shed any tears, was how it would start. But instead, a giant greenish tentacle flew out of the portal and slammed right into his chest. It knocked the wind from his lungs and sent him sprawling backwards, skidding across the floor of the shop.
Sentient transdimensional plant creature detected.
Piper let out a scream of horror as more undulating plant-like arms began to emerge. Berg abandoned her side and tore off for the back room, leaving behind scorch marks and the smell of burning rubber. Atticus scratched his chin, perplexed. "Your brother wouldn't happen to be an unspeakable beast of horror, would he?" Vel heaved in lungfuls of air, his hand clutching at the spot on his chest where the plant had struck him. He crawled to his hands and knees, looking up at the portal as he did. A mass of slimy green tentacles were clawing their way through into their dimension. He pulled his attention away to shake his head in the boy's direction. Atticus nodded, still stroking his chin. "I didn't think so. Well, that's not good." "You think?" Piper grabbed her brother by the arm, tugging him in the direction of the door. The thick, undulating vines that swarmed around the portal were as chunky as a man's leg, and long enough that, even though they were reaching halfway across the room, the creature's body had yet to emerge. They thrashed and constricted around whatever they could touch. Inventions, scrap metal, furniture, Vel. The cyborg scrabbled against the concrete as the tendril attempted to pull him in toward the vortex.
What?
Vel wheezed in a deep breath and tried again.
What in the name of unholy fertilizer is this?
Berg reemerged from the back room, rolling around rubbish piles and dodging thrashing tentacles. He was wielding a military saber in one hand and a wooden scrub brush in the other, which he thrust at Piper.
"Quickly, Mum, your weapon of choice. I suggest you prepare to defend yourself."
He swiveled on his wheel and began to charge at the beast, swinging his sword like a windmill. Piper looked at the brush in her hands.
"What am I supposed to do with this?"
she called after the robot. But the tentacle swinging in her direction caught her focus, and she used the brush like a club to bat the thing away. It wasn't very effective. Vel was leaving tracks in the concrete with his cybernetic hand as he watched both Piper and Atticus fall prey to a pair of vines. Berg was bearing down on him, blade swirling like a saw. He let go of his purchase on the ground and rolled hard to the side, cutting across Berg's path and pulling the tentacle wrapped around him right into the arc of the sword. Purple goo burst forth as the appendage came free. The beast screamed from the other side of the portal, but the sound carried through into their world, bringing with it the bizarre, bone-chilling echo of the void it had crossed. Vel shrugged off the tendrils, which were spasming and spraying cascades of the foul purple sap across the floor. He managed to get his feet beneath him and sprinted in the direction of the siblings, dodging under a stray tentacle that took a blind swipe at his head. Behind him, Berg was screaming a high-pitched war cry and causing considerable damage, judging by the otherworldly shrieks. Piper had one arm free and was swinging wildly at the beast with her scrub brush, failing to convince it to let her go. Atticus was scouring through the piles of forgotten inventions, muttering to himself about having something just for this instance. Vel went for Piper first, latching on to the thick vine that was tightly coiled around her. He dug his metal fingers into its flesh and squeezed. The new surge of power from the recent alterations to his arm were incredible. He could feel the sinuous fibers of the tentacle begin to snap beneath his grip. In its rush to relinquish the girl, the plant thrashed violently and slammed into Piper, dazing her and forcing her to the ground. The creature's shrieks became a roar of fury as a massive maw of jagged brown, slobbering fangs emerged from the vortex in the center of the writhing mass. As Vel wrestled with one arm of the beast, another flung Berg across the room and into the wall. It gave a snarling cry of triumph, and the many tentacles began to tear at anything they could reach, destroying support beams, wall joists, and even the thick metal I-beams that held up the roof of the converted airship hangar. Vel threw away the creature's broken limb and plucked Piper up off the ground. He tucked her away from the carnage and destruction, safe from the reach of the thrashing tentacles. He turned on his heel, glancing about the shop for Atticus. Through the chaos of the collapsing hangar, he could see the boy being dragged towards the maw of the beast. He was attempting to fend off the tentacle with anything he could wrap his hands around. Vel charged forward, ducking and sidestepping the creature's attempts to snare him. He had just cleared the halfway mark of the hangar, almost close enough to grab the boy, when the monster knocked free a loose I-beam and it came crashing down, right on top of him. Vel grunted and collapsed under the weight of it, his left shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. He could taste blood where he had bitten his tongue, and was fairly certain his shoulder had been dislocated.
External damage reaching critical levels. Evasive maneuvers suggested.
Vel ignored the quip from his computer and glanced up. Atticus was nearly at the maw, screaming and flailing as he threw anything he could reach into the gaping mouth of the beast. "Bad touch! Bad touch!" Vel shrugged off the beam and forced himself to his feet. Looking down at the length of steel that nearly crushed him, he realized how lucky he had been. One end of it had snapped off at an angle, creating a sharp point. A few more degrees of tilt, and it would have impaled him rather than slamming into him. Vel knelt down, pulling the beam up under his cybernetic arm. This was insane, he thought, as he put on a burst of speed. He closed the distance, slid past Atticus, and rammed the sharpened steel into the beast's throat like a lance. It gagged and sputtered, spraying him with slime and purple goo. The creature's limbs smashed about blindly and sent the boy crashing into his display of antique teapots. Face to face with the screaming creature, Vel yelled back at it as he forced the beam farther through its anatomy, well past the entrance of the vortex. The thought ran through his mind that he was killing a monster in two realities at once. Did that mean it counted twice? A thunderous racket of crackling electricity overtook the monster's screams of pain, and suddenly Vel was showered with a flood of purple, sappy ooze. The maw of the creature went limp, slumping around the metal beam, and its tentacles, while still flopping about the floor, lost all strength and intent. Vel tried to scrape some of the goo out of his eyes.
"What just happened?
Piper peeked out from the other side of the portal device.
Well, I figured it was coming through the portal, so if we got rid of the portal, it couldn't come through no more. So, I closed it.
She gestured at a portion of Atticus's device that had been smashed to pieces with a heavy metal bar from some forgotten contraption. Vel looked from the girl to the creature laying dead on the floor. It had been cleaved cleanly in two, the other half gone with the closing of the vortex. He looked back at the girl, his features pulling into a half grin.
Why didn't I think of that?
Piper grinned.
'Cause I'm brilliant, of course.
Vel shrugged with a sigh and raised a brow at her.
Yeah, I suppose. But maybe next time just try turning off the power switch rather than smashing it.
Piper paused, attempting to think of a good retort, but was interrupted by the sound of someone whistling. They turned to see Al walk through the destroyed doorway. He paused long enough to take in the state of the room, shook his head, stepped over a quivering vine, and resumed carrying a bag of groceries into the back room, muttering,
Every bloody Wednesday, I swear.
Of Tyrants and Teakettles is Book 2 of the ongoing Sci-Fantasy series by author Lesley Herron. Join us as the adventure unfolds, with new chapters releasing every few weeks.
Gah, if it's not the bloody teapot going on a rampage, it's giant tentacles, or metal rodents with a taste for human flesh. That one time he tried drilling to the center of the earth and we had lava spilling out of the loo. Well, I'm not one to complain. Nah, not me. It's just my job to take care of the madmen, right? T'ain't nothing I can do about it. But if I wake up and find one more set of rockets attached to me shoes, or another shaving razor with built-in hair clippers, I'm asking for a bloody raise. A bloody raise.